Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, Premier Doug Ford has found some new critics in the province, and interestingly enough, they're conservatives who think his government isn't being conservative enough. John Michael McGrath and I will tackle that. Plus, the fight to preserve Franco-Ontarian heritage in Sturgeon Falls, Ontario. Okay, here come John Michael McGrath and yours truly with this week's edition of On Poly. JMM.
Sir.
Little sugar for starts. You're wearing a Canada Goose today. I'm not sure why.
The Wawa Goose again. I like this T-shirt, and I decided to wear it again.
I think you need to start putting more focus and more priority on coming up with new and fascinating T-shirts for me to get interested and excited about, because I don't want to start seeing repeats already.
What else is this job for, if not
to impress me with your T-shirt collection?
T-shirts.
I agree. I'm going to, Tina, can we get a shot of this over here? This is me today. This is Frank Miller, and I'm not telling you why I'm wearing Frank Miller yet. You're going to have to let the suspense linger, because we're going to come to it later.
Yeah, right, but we are going to mention that if you are listening to this on your phone or watching on YouTube at home, you are getting the podcast a little bit later than usual, and that is because you, sir, were actually at my alma mater this week. You were speaking at TMU.
That is true. I gave a little speech at Toronto Metropolitan University yesterday at their convocation. 600 students, I think, in the audience at what they used to call Maple Leaf Gardens, now the Mattamy Athletic Centre. And yeah, fascinating. I'm actually going to write a column in the future about what I saw yesterday, because it was both fascinating and disturbing for some other reasons. So I think that conflict makes for an interesting story.
Well, I graduated from, it was then called Ryerson University in 2009, so mumble years ago. So I can only assume that the student body has substantially improved since I left.
I don't know about that. And that's one of the things I want to write about.
All right.
Anyway,
well,
we'll get back to that more. Yeah, more on that later. In the meantime, shall we get on with the show?
Let's go to it.
Off to issue one. Project Ontario is a new grassroots organization that believes the Ontario PC Party under Doug Ford has lost its conservative bona fides. They think it's time for a course correction. Conversely, PC Party insiders say the movement's beliefs are far outside the province's mainstream. Joining us now to discuss just how outside he is or isn't, here's Matthew Spoke, one of the founders of Project Ontario. Matthew, welcome to our little table here at On Poly. And why don't we just start with why you think you need this initiative right now?
Well, maybe I'll start by just correcting some of the language. This is quite an informal gathering of people with ideas. I wouldn't frame us as an organization or necessarily a movement. And I don't want this to be a discussion around Doug Ford personally or, specific decisions this province has made. I think what sort of got us together was a frustration that there's just a sense of missed opportunity in the province. We've had a PC government now for coming up on 7 years. And we're looking at, what are the lists of accomplishments that we could be proud of as movement conservatives in the province.
So you launched with, among other things, an essay on the hub, and the reaction has not been uniformly positive among some of your conservative friends. So we have a clip here of Doug Ford's ex-director of communications, Larissa Waller, about what she had to say.
Great.
There's a batch of conservatives that would like to be ideologically pure in their personal definition of what it means to be a conservative, and they think that they own that definition, and they would rather lose and not form government and, go to sleep at night thinking that they're right and everybody else is wrong.
She also wrote a column where she said Ontarians are backing a version of conservatism under the current government that is, quote, modern and realistic, while the vision that you and your colleagues are laying out would, quote, shrink the definition of conservatism into something rigid and unworkable and, frankly, unelectable. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll say, firstly, that we have a bunch of areas of policy that we want to start elaborating on that we haven't yet done. So, all that we've put out into the public realm is really an introductory piece of the fact that we intend to talk more about ideas, and we're going to follow up with that on that piece with policy pieces on healthcare, on education, on housing, on economic growth and productivity, on public safety, and we may go beyond that. Our objective with these pieces is really to start conversations within the movement, not to be seen as contrarians to the current government. I think there are areas of policy that we could point to that we think the Ford government has done a reasonably good job, but our general observation is that there have been missed opportunities, and when I look at, the legacy of previous premiers, you often find that after they leave office, they start listing out the regrets of the things that they didn't do while they had the chance to do it. We've now been governing for 7 years in this province. That won't last forever. One day the opposition will get their act together and they will dethrone the PCs. And we'll look back and say, oh, wouldn't it have been nice if we had accomplished this list of things that we never got around to?
So give us an example. What's something that you believe your Project Ontario would focus on in a way that's different from the current government?
Well, I guess I'd frame it as, if we look at statistics that rank us on important metrics and, quality of life or economic productivity or housing starts and completions or healthcare wait times, you go down the list across major policy areas, and we are not leading the country, let alone the developed world, in many respects. I mean, productivity in Ontario has flatlined for a decade. Housing starts are now at the lowest in the country.
We know all this. What do you want to do about it?
Yeah, so I don't want to get ahead of. I'm not the only one contributing policy pieces, so I don't want to dive into one specific area of policy. But I think there are steps that could be taken by a provincial government that require some courage, that are not necessarily always going to be the most politically popular policy prescription to a problem. But when you have a third majority term, it sort of seems like the opportunity to take risks and to...
One example, Matt.
Sure.
One example
Yeah.
of one thing you do differently from the current Ford government, which would be more in line with what you'd like to see happen.
Well, I'll speak to one area that I know better than most, just because I work in housing and real estate development. On housing, we've now had 3 consecutive ministers of municipal housing municipal affairs and housing that have promised meaningful reforms to how housing gets approved in the province. Many of those reforms have either not taken place or have been very, very slow to move as we've watched the statistics sort of go in the wrong direction on housing starts. So land use policy, development charges, things that the province is now talking about that we're encouraged by. I'll hold my judgment until I see sort of like formal policy getting put forward in the House. But, we think there's a lot more that could be done on the taxes and the land use reforms that would allow for more types of housing getting built faster across the province. So that's one area that I could speak to with some, specific knowledge.
When you laid out the vision in that hub piece, you also mentioned affordable housing, you mentioned childcare, strong healthcare and education systems. These are things that the current government says they want too. They are spending money in large sums to deliver some of these things. So how do you see a Conservative government more to your liking doing those differently?
Well, let me take healthcare childcare as an example, and this, again, an area that I focus on quite a bit. My wife owns a French preschool in Toronto. It's a policy area that's obviously been very impactful to daycare and preschool operators over the last couple of years as federal and provincial policy has shifted that industry towards a more subsidized system. And I think there's a lot of merit to putting federal and provincial dollars behind making sure families have access to childcare. The way it's been rolled out has been very much at the expense of small business owners and small business operators, in many cases micro businesses. My wife's preschool is 24 kids learning French in Toronto. And she's now met hundreds of operators across the province that have felt squeezed by policies that have just been miscalibrated. Not that the intents are incorrect, not that the broad policy objective is misguided, but that the implementation could have been done significantly better. On that one in particular, there's obviously a dynamic where it needs to be negotiated with the federal government, where the funding is coming from. But as a simple point of pet peeve, there is no means test in terms of who gets access to a subsidy for childcare in this province. Meaning, wealthy families that were already in childcare centers are now getting discounts while lower income families are waiting on wait lists. And I think there is very obvious policy solutions to that as an example, right? So on healthcare, we've talked a lot about this as a movement for decades now. Coming out of the pandemic, it seemed like there was, for a very brief window of time, public support for meaningful reform in our healthcare system. The healthcare system showed signs of fragility through COVID-19 that we all saw firsthand, ICU beds and other things. Wait lists for primary care physicians, wait lists for specialists continue to go up across the province. And not that this is uniquely an Ontario problem, this is a Canadian problem, but generally speaking, relative to our peers, we tend to perform worse. And we're unwilling to, try alternative approaches. Even within the context of a single payer system, we think there are ways that we could be innovating on service delivery that would move the needle a lot more quickly.
There are always dangers when people within the same family bring these discussions, these debates, into the public realm.
Yes.
The people who are in certainly prefer these conversations to happen behind closed doors so that you all look like a beautiful united front.
Yeah, of
and
course.
clearly there are some chinks in the armor here. So the question becomes, are you concerned that some conservatives will look at what you're attempting to do, well-intentioned as it is, as being disloyal?
I mean, I'm not a spokesperson for the party in any official capacity. I would consider myself a loyal conservative, small c, both at the provincial and federal level. But I generally get motivated by ideas, and what frustrates me about the official apparatus is when it is not convening discussions on ideas, then we are not actually improving the strength of our movement. I think we have benefited from a relatively weak opposition over the last several elections. I think it's led to good electoral outcomes. I don't think that we can rely on that as a strategy forever. And I think if we don't look to a governing track record as the purpose to be a political party is not only to win elections, it's to actually implement change that aligns with your ideology. And I think there are ways to do that. I mean, I'll go back to Ms. Waller's clip. I don't think what we are proposing is an ideological purity test. I think we're proposing very pragmatic things that in many respects have public support. To me, the risk is not debate. The risk is complacency. Our opponents are going to get stronger. They're going to get better organized. They're going to eventually see an opportunity to dethrone the current government. And we get weak by not challenging ourselves on policy ideas.
There was a phrase used in that hub essay. You called for renewed state capacity, and this is a phrase that I've seen a lot of conservatives in the U.S. use, and I'm intrigued to see it make its way north of the border. But maybe if you could, for our audience, define what you mean by state capacity and why you think it's important.
Well, and so Ms. Waller actually, recently, I think this morning, in fact, published a piece on sort of a critique of what we're up to at Project Ontario. And one of the things she pointed to was the track record of the Ford government on infrastructure. And I think infrastructure is one of these areas where they have a lot to talk about. They're building Highway 413. They're building the Ontario line. They're promising, the Eglinton LRT. We can talk about that from many angles.
We're going to talk about it later. Don't you worry.
I'd say. I'm encouraged that we now have a government that is prioritizing infrastructure, particularly in the city of Toronto. We should really never stop building infrastructure in this city. I think there is a view that we could be doing these things more efficiently. I will take infrastructure versus no infrastructure, but if we're going to build infrastructure, I'd rather it be done cost efficiently and on schedule and in a way that sort of matches what peer nations around the world might spend for similar infrastructure, and that is not the case. So that would be an example of state capacity. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what Ontarians expect from their government is that the services and infrastructure projects that we need are delivered to us, but they're delivered to us with respect for taxpayer dollars. And so, all else being equal, I'm glad the Ontario line is getting built. I'm glad the Eglinton LRT will one day see the light of day. I wish these things were done, on a faster and tighter budget. And I think that's a pretty fundamental pillar of conservatism is just fiscal responsibility with taxpayer money.
But another part of conservatism, at least how conservatives have governed, has not really been friendly necessarily with the idea of a active and competent public service, if I can put it that way, right? Like a Metrolinx that was competent and energetic enough to deliver the crosstown on time and on budget might also be competent enough to say that a tunnel under the 401 is not a great idea. And, that is, to my mind, that is where the tension with conservative politics has always arrived, where, whether you want to talk about Stephen Harper or Doug Ford or his late brother as mayor, there's at least a suspicion of public service where there isn't outright antagonism to the public service. And so I just wonder if you see an actual a possibility for a truce between conservatives and the state capacity that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask the average public servant in Ontario, they would probably agree that they would be a lot more proud of their jobs if the outcomes were measurably better for the province. I don't think that, my version of conservatism is not privatize everything. It's not cut the public service at all cost. It's demand outcomes that are reasonable outcomes, demand outcomes that are respectful of the money we're spending on these things, whether it's on day-to-day services we get from the province or major infrastructure projects. And I think that you would find many public servants would agree with that sentiment, that if you work at Metrolinx, you probably are the first and most frustrated about the outcomes on the Eglinton LRT project. I don't think it is controversial to say that that project could have been managed differently. And luckily, I think, the Ontario line is a good example where now we've learned lessons from mistakes on prior infrastructure projects that I suspect are not being remade. And that also goes to show that
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, but we can improve the public service by continuously investing in these things. So, Metrolinx gets better the more infrastructure projects we build, because it's not a 1 in 50-year infrastructure project. Now we'll take these on more frequently, and you'll maintain more institutional knowledge, more expertise in-house. And I think that just makes the agency stronger, and it makes the province stronger because we get more quality infrastructure at lower cost.
Matt, we're going to keep an eye on what Project Ontario has up its sleeve, and we thank you for coming into TVO tonight to talk to us about it. Not at all. Great to have you. That's Matt Spoke, Project Ontario. So we will give JMM a chance to switch seats with Matt, and then we'll come back with issue 2. Premier Doug Ford has been vocal in his support for new mining projects in Ontario's north, most particularly around the Ring of Fire in the remote northwest. After last February's election, the government introduced Bill 5, which makes it easier and faster to get mines opened. However, it's also sparked a backlash from some Indigenous communities who claim their rights are being sacrificed in the pursuit of economic expediency. Ford then got into some very treacherous territory when he made what he now acknowledges were some very ill-advised comments about Indigenous people. Doug Ford.
We're giving them $3 billion, with a B, $3 billion to be equity partners to make their communities more prosperous and wealthier. This is like handing an opportunity on a silver platter to First Nations that by the way, I have treated like gold. There's going to be a point that you can't just keep coming hat in hand all the time to the government. You got to be able to take care of yourselves. And when you literally have gold mines, nickel mines, every type of critical mineral that the world wants, and you're saying, no, I don't want to touch that. By the way, give me money. Not going to happen.
That cap in hand comment was not particularly well received in Indigenous communities. The NDP MPP Saul Mamakwa, who is Indigenous, expressed deep offense at the Premier's comments, and he responded on behalf of Indigenous people everywhere. Saul Mamakwa.
As First Nations, we are not beggars. We don't need those type of comments from a Premier. And today I would ask for his apology for those comments, those racist comments. I ask because not as an individual, not as First Nations, but also, for the people of Ontario.
So Mamakwa also said that he believes the Premier has a fundamental lack of understanding around the treaty relationships. Just for context here, treaties are legally binding agreements between Indigenous communities and the Crown. Some of the treaties in Canada date back to before there was a federal or provincial government, and governments are bound by what's called the duty to consult, right? This is a legal constitutional obligation. The government cannot legislate away Indigenous rights. Of course, that isn't to say that legislation can't negatively affect Indigenous rights, which is what we are talking about right now, right? Insofar as the province has a case to make here, I think unquestionably not made terribly well by the Premier, it is true that while First Nations have a right to be consulted, particularly when we're talking about projects that are in their traditional territories, and that consultation has to be meaningful engagement. The Supreme Court has said that it can't be like a box-ticking exercise, right? The Supreme Court has also said that Indigenous people do not have the ultimate power to say no. They don't have a veto over projects that would otherwise be approved by a federal or provincial government.
Well, we should point out that the comments landed very badly this week, as Saul Mamakwa pointed out, and as a result, Doug Ford did offer an apology on Thursday, a full-throated apology, which was accepted by the chiefs that he met with at the time. Let's take a look at that. Doug Ford.
I get passionate because I want to help people. That's what it is. And I speak from the heart. and sometimes my words don't come out properly, which I think you've all seen over a number of years. But I'm never too shy to go up and say, my words that came out yesterday, this is what I'm trying to do is prosperity. And I sincerely apologize if that has offended anyone.
Permission to get on a soapbox for a moment.
Permission granted.
So this whole dispute is happening because the province wants more mineral exploration and exploitation in the north. I use exploitation just purely in a sort of economic term there. That is, in turn, being driven in large part by the dreams that the provincial and federal governments have about developing a major EV sector in the continental auto market. We need these minerals to build batteries and other critical electronics, and we are really hoping that Ontario can be the supplier for not just the North American market, but ideally the world, right? So far, the auto sector in this province has been promised something like $30 billion in subsidies, massive tariff protections that they are currently enjoying from Chinese automobiles that are hurting other Canadian export sectors like agriculture as we speak, all on the promise that someday the auto sector will be able to deliver EVs that consumers can actually buy. They have not delivered an automobile that consumers can buy yet. That is not even mentioning the multiple previous rounds of bailouts and subsidies that the auto sector in this province has received. So, look, the Premier has apologized. The apology has been accepted. I won't belabor that further, but I will say that there are lots of people who come to Queen's Park cap in hand asking for money, often billions of dollars of money, and somehow the Treasury has never closed to them.
Very fair point to make. I do want to talk about the politics of this for a moment, in particular for the Premier, because as he pointed out, he does have a habit over the years of saying things that on further reflection he may want to take back. Unlike a lot of politicians who, on certain circumstances, will double down when they do a dumb thing, this Premier actually doesn't do that. He does come out, he does apologize. Often it's, a day or two later once he's had a chance to get some advice from a lot of people who've suggested to him, Premier, you may want to rethink that. And voters, I think, tend to cut him a lot of slack because of that. But here is the point, and I want to just pick up on the point that you made earlier here and just embellish on it a little more. Our understanding of these issues has to go back more than 5 or 10 years. Yes, there are good and important reasons to try to exploit the critical minerals that are in the Ring of Fire and elsewhere to help Ontario prosper. And yes, there are many Indigenous groups that are actually keen to participate in those projects and share in the bounty that may emerge. But history goes back more than 10 years. Yes. In this case, it goes back hundreds of years, as you point out, to before times when Canada was actually Canada. When the Crown made agreements, the power of the Crown made agreements with the ancestors of today's First Nations, and successive representatives of the Crown, namely our governments, have not necessarily been particularly enthusiastic about fulfilling those obligations. These are signed treaties that need to be respected. I mean, either we are a province, a country of laws, or we're not. And I think we are, and I think we should be. So at the end of the day, let's get all sides to the table. Let's figure this out. Let's make sure we come to agreements that everybody can be happy with so that everybody wins. That's not that controversial to say, I don't think.
No, and we know what it looks like when things go very badly, right? We are still dealing with the both environmental and legal and financial impacts of grassy narrows. People, if they were already going long, so I will say that if people don't know about that, they should just Google it. It's a very long and sad story, and Ontario is up to its neck in responsibility for that one. So it is not. We have a history of putting economic progress ahead of Indigenous rights, and it's not a great one. So
now let me do a little segue here, because while we're on the subject of the Premier having said things that he then thought he needed to apologize for, perhaps along with the events of the past week, what would be at the top of the list would be the Greenbelt.
Yes.
And, well, there was some developments on that file this week. Why don't you bring us up to speed?
There was indeed. The Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario released a report last week that included new details on the investigations into the Greenbelt scandal. Doug Ford's staff were using code words to talk about the Greenbelt deal that would have benefited some developers to the tune of $8 billion. Here is what the Premier had to say about the revelation that his staffers were using code words.
Well, they need to follow the rules, and that's as simple as that. They don't follow the rules, they're held accountable. People don't, can I tell you something? People don't give two hoots about this Greenbelt. That's done, that's gone, and we're moving forward with it. But it doesn't even, when we do our polling, it doesn't even show up.
People don't give two hoots about the Greenbelt?
Well, I think some people give many hoots about this. You and I have devoted many a hoot on this podcast. And like the RCMP seem to give at least a hoot and a half. Maybe we can round that up to two hoots, you know?
Okay. Well, let's stop counting hoots for a second and tell us what the Information and Privacy Commissioner actually had to say.
So as somebody who learned how to use computers with an old command line interface, this like really hit me in my deep nerdy core. I was very intrigued by this. So the government, the commissioner found that the government broke its legal obligation in terms of keeping records of their actions. Staffers were using code words like GB or G to refer to this Greenbelt deal that they were looking to push through. They were also, though, and this is where we get to the computer nerdy bit, they were using G with two asterisks. And if you know anything about like old, doing directory searches on an old DOS computer, or even now if you use asterisks when you do searching, what it means is it will capture everything with the letter G in it. And so it functionally makes it impossible to search for things like emails and other government documents that would be relevant to a freedom of information request. And on top of that, the commissioner also suggested that some emails might have been permanently deleted, which is also a no-no. So Privacy Commissioner Patricia Kosame said that while these practices occur, it greatly affects government transparency and hurts public trust.
Which may add up to more than a couple of hoots at the end of the day.
It's maybe.
It may. Now, the official opposition at Queen's Park is, of course, hoping that this may spur wider RCMP investigation and or involvement. What do they want to see?
Right. NDP leader Marit Stiles has said that they are tapping the RCMP's Sensitive and International Investigations Unit, which deals with complaints related to elected officials. Of course, the NDP has no power to directly influence the investigation, but they are asking the RCMP to include this as part of their ongoing investigation. Again, just to remind our listeners that the government is currently subject to an RCMP investigation about all this. Stiles said that opposition parties have run out of their own channels to investigate the scandal. They've used all of the levers they can pull at Queen's Park. So they are using the various commissioners and auditors and making their appeals to the RCMP for these types of things. She's also repeated the request for a public inquiry into this whole affair. The government controls whether a public inquiry is called, and I think you could just assume that's not going to happen under this current government.
I'm not sure. I think there's a line about snowballs in hell or something like that
exactly.
that probably comes to mind right now. Anyway, well, we're going to keep an eye on this as the events warrant. And with that, we're off to issue 3. It's been 14 years since shovels hit the ground on the Eglinton Crosstown LRT project, which goes west to east, east to west across the middle of Toronto. Now we are hearing that the keys to the line have been handed over to the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission. So what does this effectively mean?
Right. So just a refresher that the Crosstown is one of the public-private partnerships that was in vogue under the Liberal government. It is being built, or has been built, by a private consortium. It will be owned by the provincial government, but it will be the TTC that operates it. And so this week we have learned that the TTC is finally getting the keys to the thing, and they we believe that they've been, training drivers on how to, run these trains, and they're going to spend a few months sort of shaking it down and making sure that everything works. Metrolink's interim president and CEO, Michael Lindsay, told reporters earlier this week that the TTC had, in fact, been handed control of the LRT about a week ago. So, they are now really in control of the movement of trains on the line. As I've mentioned before, if you have traveled along Eglinton for the last few months, you might have actually seen a train on those tracks, but that's been Metrolinx operating things. Now the TTC is going to be responsible for running them and doing those test runs and training up their drivers. When they are ready to move ahead, there will be a period of formal trial running for about 2 weeks, and then what's called a month-long revenue service demonstration. No passengers will actually be on board the trains during that time. They are also integrating some of the lessons that were learned from the Ottawa LRT, which is that's the context for why this, or at least part of the context for why this has taken so long. The Ottawa LRT had a very bad opening, and then eventually a derailment that the province very much does not want to repeat in Toronto. So lots of testing, lots of I's being dotted and T's being crossed as they move towards an eventual opening.
I have an important follow-up question.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen any sinkholes yet? You think we're sort of kidding here, but the folks in Ottawa know well that one of the biggest problems they had there was a sinkhole. Like the earth literally collapsed.
It is almost biblical in how...
It truly was, how cursed that thing was. But we haven't seen any sinkholes yet.
No, I have not seen any sinkholes yet.
Okay, very good. Now,
do we knock on wood?
I know Premier Ford did say that he expected the LRT to open, finally, in September.
Yes.
I assume he means September 2025.
Yeah, yes, one hopes at this point. The TTC, as we say, that they still have stress testing to do before what they call revenue service will begin, hopefully in September of this year. This takes time. It feels cruel to ask people to be patient because, of course, Toronto has been patient about this long delayed project. There is, of course, we are a northern city, and they might open it in September when we still maybe have the last little bits of nice, pleasant, sunny weather. Yeah. And then winter is going to come because winter is always coming in the city. And it might be a particularly nasty winter. And the one concern that they have is that the line might open in September. And then if we get walloped with a bad snowstorm, parts of the crosstown are underground, but particularly in the East End, it's a surface LRT. And so they will have to deal with weather just as surely as buses and streetcars do in Toronto currently. So we will have to make sure that everybody is all trained up for that thing that every other Canadian knows as winter, but sometimes Toronto seems to forget. And we will see if we get that fall opening, in fact.
Well, in fairness, our winters are not as bad as Ottawa's winters, and Ottawa's winters really did put the kibosh on their LRT for quite a while.
It's true, yeah. The Ottawa LRT seemed to, I sincerely, I don't want to keep dumping on the Ottawa LRT, but at one point it was closing both for being too cold in the winter and also getting too hot in the summer. And I was born in Ottawa. I still think fondly of the city of my birth, but that feels to me like somebody got something badly wrong.
Okay. Now, with that, let's go to the mailbag, and we take your emails, of course, at onpolitics@tvo.org. What do we got this week, JMM?
We have an email from Whitney Holmes in Lakefield, Ontario, who writes, "Hey, Steve and JMM. On Friday, June 13th, Steve wore a Kathleen Wynne t-shirt and talked about her significance as the first female leader and premier. While I appreciate noting what you did, you missed the very important note that she was the first 2S LGBTQIA leader of a party and premier as well. Especially since it is Pride Month, this was an omission that should have been included." Whitney from Lakefield, Ontario.
Whitney, I am going to say you are 100% right. I'm glad you wrote because it is June, it is still Pride Month, and it does give us the opportunity to mention that this week. I'm trying to think of why I neglected to mention it last week. Certainly Premier Wynne has taken a lot of justifiable pride in being the first ever female premier.
Yes.
If you go to the second floor of Queen's Park and you look at all the portraits of all of the former premiers, there's 24 white men and her. Yes. So she does stand out. She is different. She made history. It is also true to say that Premier Wynne has never particularly thought of herself as having gotten into public life to be a champion for LGBTQ issues.
Yes.
We do have to remember that what got her into politics in the first place was actually her, thorough disgust with the Mike Harris government and the education reforms it was making. So she ran to become a trustee for the Toronto Board initially, which she won, and then she moved over to Queen's Park in 2003. So it was education that actually got her in.
Yeah.
But it is certainly fair to say that the issue of sexual orientation ought to be a significant part of her resume, a part of her legacy, because, well, I'll tell you what, I will never forget and I'll never forget it because it was the best convention speech I've ever heard in my life. And I've covered a bunch of leadership conventions over the years. I've probably heard 100 convention speeches, if you consider all the candidates who've given them in running for the leadership of their party. Kathleen Wynne gave the best one I ever heard. And it was something like, she talked about a lot of different issues. And then she basically, as Robert F. Kennedy used to say, if you've got a problem, shine a lantern on it. Yeah. She wasn't going to, downplay this issue. She knew it was a concern for some delegates in the Liberal Party. And she basically said, are we really at a place in the 21st century where if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, you are somehow disqualified from being successful in running for the leadership of our party? I hope not, was the message to the delegates. And I have no doubt that that speech, because it was so powerful, moved delegate votes on the convention floor that day and helped her win. So, Whitney, thank you for bringing that to our attention, and we are happy to add it to the Premier's list of accomplishments.
And I do want to add one other thing about that speech, which I always remember, because I remember I was watching it at home, and I remember cackling because she had a great line. The Premier had a great line, or I guess the Premier-to-be, from earlier in the speech. It started off with something like, we've got to address the elephant in the room. I know lots of people are talking about it, and yes, I have to acknowledge I am an MPP from Toronto or something like that.
Yes.
And
yes.
It's funny in retrospect, but that was one of the other big knocks against her in the leadership campaign at the time was okay, fine, she might be a lesbian, but she's also from Toronto, and that was making Liberals
worse.
As squeamish as the other thing.
Well, we've had very, 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 very few premiers who represented Toronto ridings. Kathleen Wynne was one. Doug Ford obviously is one. Yeah. Bob Rae was one. And people are going to have to help me if as I try to think of another one. I'm not talking about GTA, because Bill Davis was Brampton, got the Davis reference in, but for the 416, how many premiers have we had from the 416?
I don't know. I was scouring.
I think that's it.
And I mean, it's funny also in retrospect, given that was such an undertone of her leadership bid at the time, but it's now been 12 years, and we've there've been only 2 premiers, but for 12 years straight, the Premier of Ontario has represented a Toronto riding, and
which does not happen.
No, it
has not happened.
Has
before.
not happened.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, you want to give the email address and we'll get out of here?
Right. Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, June 20th, 2025.
You can follow our shows on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
We always like to finish off by thanking our wonderful studio crew for making the video podcast happen, so thanks, gang. Great to have you here. We've got our season finale next Friday, one more program for the end of June, and until then, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Abitibi Pulp and Paper Mill and world-famous caviar were once the economic drivers of jobs and development in Sturgeon Falls, located in northeastern Ontario. The predominantly French-speaking community in West Nipissing is also known for a precedent-setting fight for a French high school in the 1970s. And in the latest installment of TVO's documentary series, Crossroads, Beyond Boom and Bust, we learn about this community's rich French language heritage and how Sturgeon Falls is evolving and working to keep its young people in the area. So, joining us now for more on this, James Hislop. He is executive producer of Crossroads, Beyond Boom and Bust, and Michel Gervais, a resident of Sturgeon Falls, Ontario. And it's great to have you two in those chairs. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, James, what was it about Sturgeon Falls that you thought would make for a great episode of this documentary?
So the thesis of our series is what happens to a small town when the reason it exists no longer exists. And sadly and sometimes wonderfully, Ontario has a lot of small towns that fit that bill. Sturgeon Falls was unique in the sense that, like many of the small towns, it started with a mill or a transportation hub or a factory that time or technology had eclipsed. And in Sturgeon Falls' case, the mill and then the caviar. When those two mainstays of employment went away, rather than either turning it into a ghost town or trying to reinvent themselves in a similar incarnation of what they were. The town pivoted significantly and became a center for embracing their French language rights and the French language culture.
Which is about 60% of the people who live there.
60%. And then not only that, a lot of the small towns we deal with, people, as soon as they become 16, they say, I'm out of here, I'm going to the big city. And the inverse is happening in Sturgeon Falls, where people are either staying or going away and then coming back. So the town actually has growth versus decline. In a lot of the small towns, it's how do you manage the shrinking of the small town and then the absence of services and resources for the community. And Sturgeon Falls reinvented itself in a number of different ways. And one of the big ways was Franco-Ontarian culture. And then, of course, being very inclusive and with the queer culture.
We're going to get to that in a second, but just refresh my memory here. I think it was 2002 when the mill disappeared?
Correct.
Yeah, right?
That's
02?
right.
Okay. And the caviar industry, and now, it's gone.
It's gone, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Michelle, tell us about your French heritage in Sturgeon Falls.
Yeah, my family's been here in Sturgeon Falls for as long as, probably since the turn of the 1900s, I would say. So virtually everyone in my family speaks French, and probably so my grandfather, Dr. Roger Gervais, was one of the 3 Francophone school board members during the education crisis. And my other grandfather as well, Gaetan Seri, was also really involved in a lot of the activism and...
And you're born there?
And I was born there.
Born and raised?
Born and raised, Sturgeon
And
Falls.
still there?
Still there. I left for about 5 years to Toronto, and then I came back. But
What drew you back?
Pardon me?
What drew you back?
What drew me back? Honestly, a pandemic helped, but also just being home, speaking French again. Being in the city, it was nice. I loved it, but I was noticing myself kind of struggling more with my French, and that was something that I never thought would happen. And because it's so important to me to really be speaking my language with my family, with my friends, coming back really was an opportunity to kind of just re-familiarize myself with my language. And
that's a theme that the documentary keeps coming back to, because there is first things first. Sturgeon Falls is as Francophone a community as it is because of a really neat story about a priest from many years ago. You want to tell that story?
No.
Papa
I'm not familiar with that one.
Papa Hadzi, so he would travel to Europe and would kind of, mythologize the North, especially West Nipissing, and kind of invite the, families to come to places like Verner to get it, some land and to develop farming and things like that. And so that convinced a lot of people, and then winter happened, and but
I gathered then when the jobs disappeared, the Anglophones left, but the Francophones
exactly.
stayed.
The poor Francophone people, they couldn't afford to leave, so they stayed, and that's over time just what kind of grew the French community in those areas.
Okay, you touched on this business about a French high school and the efforts, it's more than 50 years ago right now, to get a French high, there was an elementary school, but not a high school. And go ahead, Sheldon, bring up the photo from that time, because these were serious protests. Nous voulons notre école. We want our school, as opposed to the English school, right?
I think one of the things that some of the feedback we get, particularly in the stories we do that have Franco-Ontarian communities, is I think it's an underserved and underrepresented group. I mean, when we think of French culture in Canada, we immediately think of Quebec, and then maybe l'Acadie. But the Franco-Ontarian culture... Acadia.
There we go. Yep.
We forget that there's a very substantial and thriving French culture in Ontario, the Franco-Ontarian. And I think, what happened in Sturgeon Falls was a turning point for recognition and acceptance as a culture and a language and a way of living that needed to be embraced rather than shunned or even worse, just completely ignored.
And there is a kind of there's a deep concern among the Francophone population there that it's up to us. It's our responsibility to hang on to
exactly. Who
that
else is going to
culture.
do it? We're here. We want, we are a majority in population, and we just want to be able to exist in our language. It's speaking, what we're comfortable speaking.
Exactly. You come from a very political family, I have learned.
do.
Okay,
Yes.
you want to go through a bit of a list of some of the people who've gone
Sure.
into public life in your family?
Yeah, so I have my grandfather, Gaetan Serré, who was MP from 1968 to 72. My uncle, Marc Serré, my mom's brother, who, was MP from 2015 to this year. And I have
He's still the MP there, right?
no longer.
Oh, did it?
No.
Did he lose in the last election?
Yeah.
No kidding. I
Yeah.
missed that. Okay.
And
He was nickel belt, I think, wasn't he?
correct, yeah.
Okay.
And my grandfather as well. And then I have my great uncle, Ben Serré, who was provincial MP for Timiskaming Cochrane.
I remember him.
in the
He was
late
an
90s.
MPP.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So, okay, I'm going to ask the obvious question. It's obviously in the DNA of the family for you guys to go into politics. You thinking about it?
No. Not, I would say not in government politics necessarily, but I'm part of the West Pacific Pride Committee. I was president for 3 years. Now I just stepped down as vice president. But activism is really important to me, and especially for queer rights, rural queer rights, and even more niche, francophone rural queer rights. I think it's really my people. So that's really who I advocate for.
Gotcha. We've talked about how many of the jobs have disappeared, and therefore you would assume, like so many communities in Canada, the population goes down. The biggest export is youth, right? Young people leave. How has the community actually grown in recent years?
Well, I think in a couple ways. It's by embracing the French culture and making it a place that they want to stay. People want to live there because they can live, speak, and socialize in their native tongue. And secondly, I think one of the other things is like for example, since we've finished filming the documentary, the plant has been turned into is going to be turned into a very vibrant community center. So it's about making the community an attractive place and embracing all cultures, being very inclusive, with a very prominent queer community, and supporting lifestyles that you would normally disassociate with small town thinking.
That's what I was wondering, Michelle, because we are a few subway stops away from one of the largest, most active, most prominent gay communities in the whole country, right down at Church and Wellesley in Toronto. This is a long way from Church and Wellesley.
Yeah.
So how does this work?
I have a few friends that have moved here to Sturgeon Falls a couple of years ago who are queer. I've met them in Sturgeon Falls, but they saw West Pacific Pride when they were looking for where to move to, and they were like, oh, well, this small town has, some queer, life and some acceptance.
But it's not Church and Wellesley. I mean, that's a real beehive of activity.
I think not everyone necessarily wants that kind of like vibrant queer nightlife experience, and they just want to be able to live somewhere quiet and calm that has, a sort of community that can at least make them feel safe.
But also, is it fair to say that it's also fully integrated into the community? It's not been ghettoized. It hasn't been.
No, exactly.
So
it's definitely
part of the community. Is an integral part of the community versus this is, it's not been ghettoized or fragmentized.
So you feel at home there?
Yeah, honestly. I mean, it helps that I've been there my whole life, and the community knows me personally. But it seems to me that even people that come here later are able to integrate and get to know the community and still feel at home.
Is homophobia an issue?
I would say yes, of course, a little bit. Especially, the past year or two, there's been a bit more pushback than when we started. But I think they're just cowardly enough to stay home and just be behind their keyboards. So I'm going to just, be happy with that.
Let's show a clip here from this doc. That's very funny. Let's show, Crossroads Boom and Bust, Sturgeon Falls resident Riley Restool talking about why she stayed in the area. Sheldon, if you would.
I had always said in high school, I'm leaving and I'm never coming back. And I think a lot of my friends shared the same sentiment. And now that we're all getting older, people seem to want to come back. That's what happened to me, and that's what a lot of my friends are doing as well. My family's here, and my community is really close. I chose to come back because of the work that I'm hoping to do in the future. I want to work for First Nations communities in the North. I want to work for rural communities in the North, and I don't think I can do that work if I don't live in the North.
What's interesting about Sturgeon is that they're not identically sized, but you've got a big chunk of Francophone people, got a big chunk of Anglophone people, and you've got a big chunk of Indigenous people. Based on what you learned shooting this, how well do they all get along?
I think for the most part, I think it's a little bit of can be an example of how different cultures, different views on life can all come together and respect each other's differences and embrace those differences to try and build a stronger, more resilient community. And I think resilience is an important word, because without resilience, a lot of these small towns that don't have some of the features or attractions of a large center, it's the resilience of getting through, as you said, the cold winters, the distances. And so it's a little bit of not just necessity, but it's practicality, where these people, where the people in these communities come together, and as you just saw, Indigenous culture, French culture, Anglo culture, all live relatively harmoniously. I mean, it's the thing I think is wonderful is, the two competing Poutine trucks on either side of the street. I mean, and that's, they're both the best. They both attract a different and same crowd on the same day. But I think it's that it's a great emblem of the competitive nature inside of a community, but it's done with respect and a lot of fun.
Should we show him doing his thing? Okay, we're going to show you
yes.
doing your thing. Here we go. Sheldon, next clip, if you would.
Comment ça va, Sturgeon Falls? I love you all so much. On va continuer le show. Give it up for me. My name is Je ne sais pas.
There's this misconception that small town is small mind. In small towns, only small-minded people exist. And there's definitely some. But what I've been noticing is people are open and ready to accept new ideas, new people.
Et dans ma jeunesse, j'aurais jamais pensé qu'on aurait eu un espace crédible tellement acceptant de les gens et leur identité, et d'avoir un espace qui est juste vraiment développé pour les jeunes et par les jeunes aussi. C'est ça qui est vraiment important, c'est que les jeunes, faut vraiment qu'ils croient qu'ils ont une voix dans notre communauté.
I like that, incidentally, about the documentary. Go back and forth between our two official languages in this country, and you see very little of that, actually. So good for you for doing that. Okay, I got to ask you about your drag name. Je ne sais pas.
Yeah.
As in French for I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Je ne sais pas. Where'd you get that from?
Honestly, I had just turned 18. I was on a walk with my little sister, and I was coming up with funny drag names. And that was one of them, I guess, at some point, because I didn't know what to come up with. And a year later, I was in Toronto, wishing to make my little drag debut. And I went to that little notes app note, and I found the name, and it's been the case since. But for me, not knowing is kind of like a philosophy of life. We don't have all the answers. We don't know, as humans, we don't know anything really, essentially. And that's okay. And you know what I mean? So that's kind of the essence of my name.
There will be people who will watch this documentary and they will say to themselves, okay, a drag show in downtown Toronto, downtown Ottawa, whatever, I get that. Sturgeon Falls, Ontario, they've got drag queen shows like that?
We do.
It's going to be shocking to a lot of people.
You know what? Yes.
But I think the thing that is shocking is that it's absolutely not shocking to the people of Sturgeon Falls. And I think that dichotomy of it, you don't expect it in a small town in Ontario, where it is just part of the community fabric. And I think that's one of the reasons we chose Sturgeon Falls as one of the subjects in the documentary series, because what would, as you said, would be shocking really is not in Sturgeon Falls.
I think
Sorry, go ahead.
To me, when I moved back, I didn't want to compromise. I didn't want to have to let go of my drag or let go of my, language or my queerness. I just wanted to throw on a drag show like I would here. So I did, and it went well, and then we just kept doing more and more and more, and now I do shows in Sudbury and all over the north, Hearst even, and I'm just able to do my drag in Northern Ontario in French and English. I love to do bilingual shows, and I'm happy to say I didn't have to compromise that part of me.
How much did you know about Sturgeon Falls before doing this?
Caviar.
That's funny. Yeah, the people who made us, the woman who made us up today, put the makeup on us, I asked her the same question. That's what she said too. Caviar. That was it.
Yeah.
So not very much.
Very little.
What would you say is sort of the most interesting nugget you've learned about Sturgeon Falls, having now put this documentary together?
That it's a showcase of how different cultures, different backgrounds, different communities can come together, live in relative harmony with respect and friendship. And I think, as our research team went more and more and deeper into the story, it became a no-brainer for us that this was a community that, again, goes back to answer the thesis of our series: what happens to a small town when the reason it exists doesn't exist.
Yep.
And with the mill and the caviar disappearing, there would be no reason for this town to exist had not the community come together and embrace the different cultures and communities inside of their own community. And I think for us, that's a great story to tell.
Do you want people to watch this thing?
I really do.
Well, then I'm going to have to tell them when they can.
Give us a plug.
Here we go. Crossroads, Boom and Bust, Sturgeon Falls airs on TVO Wednesday, June 25th, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. You can stream it anytime on our website, TVO.org, or on TVO Today's YouTube channel. Gentlemen, thank you for the visit here at TVO, and safe back to Sturgeon Falls for you.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Enchanté.
C'est rien.
And that is the agenda for Friday, June 20th, 2025. June, of course, is Pride Month, and so we want to encourage you to check out the TVO original documentary, Parade, Queer Acts of Love and Resistance, which will air this Sunday, June 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on TVO and be available to stream for free the same day. Now, Monday on the program, we'll explore the way social media have evolved since the agenda debuted 19 years ago, and we hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.